Hi, I'm Adrienne Bell from Pearland, Texas. You're listening to Two Broads Talking Politics. Be sure to go to podcastawards.com to nominate them for an award in the news and politics category.
Hi everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics, and I'm here with Jennifer Cohn, who is an election integrity advocate and researcher and writer, and also an attorney. Hi Jennifer.
Hi Kelly.
Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with a question of what is election integrity and what first got you interested in it?
Sure. So election integrity is about making sure that our elections are free and fair so that the results of the election reflect the voters' actual intent.
Okay.
And it can relate to preventing fraud as well as unintentional errors in the election process.
Okay.
And as far as what got me interested in it, it was after the 2016 election. Like many people, I spent quite a bit of time on social media, and there was talk of Russia having hacked the election. So someone on social media was looking for volunteers to do some research about voting machine or electronic voting irregularities. So I volunteered to do that, and I really knew very little about our election system and how it was run with these computerized systems. But early on, I encountered some articles and videos done by a computer science professor at the University of Michigan named Alex Halderman. And he's also a really good communicator. And what he was explaining he wouldn't say specifically or expressly that election officials were lying to us. He wouldn't use those words, but that in effect was what he was showing, is that election officials often tell us things like voting machines can't be hacked because the voting machines don't connect to the internet. And what Halderman was saying in some articles and in videos and even in interviews on TV was that this is at best a half-truth, although the voting machines themselves typically do not connect to the internet. All voting machines, including touchscreen voting machines and tabulating equipment, optical scanners, have to receive their programming before each election from centralized computers that can and often do connect to the internet. And so you can easily alter vote tallies just by inserting malware into these centralized computers that then send it out all over the county or the entire state, and it would affect every voting machine in the county or the state. And so that was one thing that really struck me and horrified me, frankly, early on. The other thing, relating really to the same point, I don't think I heard this from Alex Halderman. I found it out from another election integrity advocate named John Brakey, that there's a company called ES&S it's the number one vendor in the United States, and it accounts for 44% of U.S. election equipment. It has a very popular optical scanner out there, and this is what would count your ballots. It's called the DS200. It's in something like 28 states, and in 2015, so just the year before the 2016 general election, they upgraded it. They called it an upgrade to include cellular modems, which IT experts then say would facilitate what's called a Maninthemiddle hack. So I found that to be very alarming as well.
And so the idea then was that not that any of this is proof that things are being hacked, but that there was a big difference between what election officials were saying in that it couldn't be hacked and the reality that in fact it could.
Yes, and that it could really easily. There was one other myth also that actually I don't know if he debunked this one or others did, but in any event, the myth is that our election system is too decentralized to allow an outcome-altering hack, and we hear this from election officials and just elected officials. I think Obama said it too, and again, it's at best a half-truth. It's incredibly misleading because the truth is that there are just two vendors, ES&S and Dominion Voting, that account for between 80 to 90% of U.S. election equipment. So I really take issue with the notion that it's our system is too decentralized to have an outcome-altering hack. You could just either have corrupt insiders at one of these two vendors could easily do it, or as actually happened in 2016, you could have a hack on a vendor from the outside, and then that could affect a very large amount of voting equipment in a very large number of states.
So you, in addition to talking about all of this on Twitter, you also write on Medium several pieces about election integrity. And so you recently did a piece on Georgia. So can you tell me why you were specifically focused on Georgia?
There were a number of things that brought me to be interested in Georgia. But what I think is important about Georgia for people to know is, number one, that Georgia is where our country's dependence on electronic voting machines really began. Georgia was the first state in the country to use touchscreen voting machines in an election statewide, and that was in 2002. And what was kind of striking, well, many things were actually striking about what happened in 2002, but their choice of vendor sort of set the stage for the entire country. They chose Diebold Election Systems, a company that had previously been called Global Election Systems. You've probably heard of Diebold before. They also manufacture ATMs. Mm-hmm. So they had really just gotten into the election business about 3 months earlier by making Global Election Systems into a subsidiary. And what's kind of striking about Global is that it was founded by 3 white-collar criminals, which I found quite alarming. And then I think some of those guys were all in prison around the time that Diebold bought Global, but Global still had a convicted cyber felon as a senior VP who had just been brought into the company right before the 2000 election, and who had brought along with him someone he'd met in prison, a guy named John Elder, to do punch card printing. And so we all remember what happened with the 2000 election with the punch card fiasco. Mm-hmm. Again, it doesn't prove that a criminal was behind the punch card fiasco, but it's a bit unsettling. And the other thing, so the convicted cyber felon who was brought in before that 2000 election, his name is Jeffrey Dean. And what's alarming about that, I mean, in and of itself, I find it quite alarming that happened, that it was allowed to happen, and that it didn't really get a ton of media coverage. It got a little bit, but there was an editorial by Paul Krugman in the New York Times that apparently he was alarmed, but it really didn't take off. I guess because the media concluded it's not proof of wrongdoing, but it's certainly proof of a lack of due diligence, in my opinion. In any event, that 2000 election was marked by a voting machine in Volusia County, and the voting machine was a Global Diebold machine that dropped 16,000 Gore votes, and it was just discovered by happenstance. A poll worker happened to notice Gore's vote total going down. And again, I double-checked this. It was mentioned in the New York Times, just barely mentioned, this error in Volusia County, but I found it incredibly disturbing that just before that election, they had hired a convicted cyber felon to take a senior management position, and apparently he did quite a bit of programming for the company. So this is who Georgia chose, and it set the stage for many other states also choosing Diebold. I guess it is sort of the broader picture. So, once a vendor gets their hooks into a state and that state uses their machine statewide, and maybe they had to change their statutes to allow this type of electronic voting. They chose paperless. Other states then tend to follow. If they think another state is doing it, it gives also a template for legislation that they can enact in their own states. And in any event, so it all sort of began in Georgia, and the 2002 elections showed an incredible shift really a seismic shift toward the Republican Party in Georgia that I'm not sure a lot of people know about. So you had the first Republican governor in 130 years. You had a senator, Saxby Chambliss, defeating a popular incumbent for the U.S. Senate. It had always been Democrats in the U.S. Senate up until 2002, and it was a 9 to 12-point swing. You also had the Republican Party taking over both chambers of the state legislature in 2002, and it's just stayed this way ever since.
Well, and that's interesting because for many years, of course, we keep hearing that Georgia might turn blue. Maybe next election, Georgia will turn blue. And so it's interesting to think that Georgia hasn't been red that long.
Right. It all really started in 2002. And it was an incredibly anomalous election with these really massive swings between the exit polls and the results. And they were using paperless voting machines, by the way, which the reason paperless is significant is it means that there's nothing that you can compare against the electronic tally to confirm whether the electronic tally has been manipulated. And so it literally makes a recount impossible. Sometimes they might call it a recount, but all it is rerunning the electronic machines, and if they've been hacked to flip votes, they'll just flip them again. So it doesn't allow you to prove if there has been fraud.
And so then the article focuses as well, so we're talking about 2002, but then focuses in on the 2016 special election in the Georgia 6th.
Yes, so the Georgia 6th election had a lot of anomalies in it as well. And one of the reasons why I think it's so important to write about Georgia is I think the country as a whole suffers from a massive confirmation bias that we were all, at least I was raised to think we had the greatest democracy in the world. And I think it's a real leap for people to accept that maybe some of our elections have been tainted. Mm-hmm. They find it really difficult to accept, especially when it comes to the vote tallies themselves. People just do not want to believe and cannot accept that perhaps some of our elections were not free and fair. And why Georgia helps, I think, to get past that confirmation bias is the corruption in Georgia and sort of the disturbing events surrounding this Georgia 6th election that happened in 2017 are so blatant that I think and I hope it may open people's eyes that we've got a serious situation here that warrants our attention. And I'm not talking so much about redoing past elections, although that would be nice. I'm talking more about protecting us going forward. So some of the things that happened in Georgia was there was a massive breach, and I write about this in my article. There was a massive breach before this Georgia. Well, actually, let me back up. The Georgia 6th election was the first. It was the most expensive House race of all time, mm-hmm. And it was Republican was Karen Handel, and the Democrat was John Ossoff. Karen Handel is a top 10 recipient of Koch money, so that's probably part of the reason it was one of the most expensive House races. It was the first chance for Democrats to flip a House seat from red to blue after Trump, so it was seen as this big litmus test for the entire country, mm-hmm. and it had a ton of attention. And yet, in the run-up to the election, there was a massive breach of Georgia's centralized election center. So this would be where all of the voting machines get that programming that I mentioned. Before each election, they get programming from centralized computers. Well, those would be housed at the election center that was breached. There were stolen e-poll books just several days. It was either before the primary or the general in that Georgia 6th election. So the e-poll books, those are electronic poll books, which we've heard a lot about. Georgia, again, it doesn't have to be Russia, but we've heard a lot about possible Russian infiltration into the voter registration systems and e-poll books not working or having the wrong data on them when people go to vote, sending them to other places or saying they're not registered. So that's the danger that you have with stolen e-poll books, is that somehow they access the systems and I don't really know how a hacker would work, but somehow make it difficult for people to vote at all. So you had those things, and then you had a primary where literally, sort of in real time, while I was on Twitter and so many people were watching this Georgia 6th election unfold, you had Ossoff ahead and really looking like he was going to just win this primary outright, and suddenly the counting stopped at about 9 o'clock at night, and you could see people freaking out on Twitter, understandably, wondering if this meant that this is where it was going to get stolen from them. And sure enough, when about an hour and a half later, when the counting started again, suddenly Ossoff dropped beneath that crucial 50% mark, which forced him into a runoff that he ultimately lost. Oh, and then after losing that runoff, there is a really perseverant election integrity advocate named Marilyn Marks who has filed a paper ballot suit before the runoff, and was defeated on a technicality, but she filed another one after